Soedira. I am from batch June of 2023 of the Intro to Data and Visualization, and this is the report of my final project. So the report here is titled "The Allied Aerial Warfare Missions in World War II," and this is done in August 2023. So the reason I'm choosing this is because it has only been 120 years since the first powered flight by the Wright brothers, but air power in military has been growing very rapidly, and many of the world's largest militaries operate thousands of active surface aircrafts. Now, when World War II broke out, the belligerents, or the countries, fought on all three domains of war: air, land, and sea, across all theaters of operation. According to the Italian aviation thinker Giorgio Duhat, the use of air power has to be independent of the other branches, the Army and Navy, but also has to work in support of the other branches to win the war. Now, in this project, we'll see if, true to Duhat's guiding principle, the use of air power is evident in winning the war for the Allied forces in World War II. We wanted to see if there are actually fewer air missions in World War II in the early stages, and then it increased as the Allied gained more of a dominance and upper hand in the battlefield in the latter stages of the war. And we'll also dive deeper into the relationship between the amount of aerial missions and the number of aircrafts used in various theater operations as the war progresses. So the data was sourced from Kaggle, titled "The Aerial Bombing Operations in World War II," authored by the U.S. Air Force. So it's a very good data source. It's actually not just the aerial bombing operations, but also included all air missions in World War II. Now, the data that we use in this project are going to be target longitude and latitude. That is the geocoded data of target locations of the air missions. The country, the allied country that carry out the missions, mission date, theater of operation, that is the geographical grouping of sub areas of warfare. In this case, the Europe, Pacific, China, Burma, India, etc. The airborne aircraft is the number of aircraft used in the missions. Target country is simply the target countries of the missions, and mission ID is used to count how many missions were launched because each mission is uniquely ID'd by the militaries. And we also stored and cleaned some data elements as follows. So country will only use Australia, Great Britain, US, and New Zealand data elements. The theater of operations will only include Europe, Mediterranean, Pacific, East Africa, and China, Burma, India, or CBI. And the mission date will only use the years and months from 1939 to 1945. We're not going to talk about the exact date and day or the weeks. Now we'll start. So this is what we see here is the the mission count of all Allied Air Forces mission count. So the top figures show that the number of missions actually increased as the war progressed, and it peaked in 1944 before it gradually dropped in 1945. And a closer look in the second figure actually reveals that despite the number of missions generally rose, the distribution of this mission in various theaters were not equal. Europe tended to have the highest number of missions, that is followed by the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters. This is because the centers of the action were where the Axis powers were based. Europe had Germany and Italy, so there were more missions in mainland Europe. And the Pacific is where Japan is based. So it explains why the distribution of the missions are not equal. And this is the map of what we were seeing earlier. As you can see, from 1939, 1940, and 1941 onwards, it gradually expanded more and more theater of operations, and it peaked in 1942 and 1943 because that was when both sides were having control of a lot of areas, and as a result, the Allied had to fight the Axis powers in various theaters of operation. Also, in 1942, it was when the U.S. Joined the war and Japan entered the war, so that's why the Pacific became more active in the war. This is the number of yearly airborne aircrafts. So this is a continuation of what we were seeing earlier. We can see that actually, we remember that the number of missions peaked in 1944, right? So the number of missions actually correlates with the number of aircrafts used. So more missions means more airborne aircraft used. So you can see that it peaked in both 1944. So and across all theaters of operation, remember Europe had the most number of missions, followed by the Pacific and the Mediterranean. So this is what we are seeing, that the in World War II, the major powers were in the Allied forces were the British and the U.S. forces, right? Now, before the U.S. joined, the British had to carry most of the air power, most of the air missions. You can see here, it peaked in 1940, 1941. Remember, Battle of Britain and the German invasion of the Mediterranean. This was when the British kind of had to fight it off alone, and yeah, the New Zealand Australian air forces were not that active because they were not as strong as the British. But when the U.S. started to enter the war in 1942, it jumped drastically to 1944, where the U.S. made like more than 40,000 missions annually across all theaters of operation. So yeah, the U.S. was clearly the major air power in World War II, with followed by the British number two. Now this is the monthly air missions from 1939 1945. We will discuss further later. So by looking closer at the time series of the bombing missions, we can see that actually the peak of each year's air missions vary according to the months. This is following the real life situation, what happened in that year and month, and we will talk about it in the next slides. So the first phase is from 1939 1942, and the second phase in 1943 and 1945. Let's talk about that. So let's talk about the first phase. This is the defensive period from 1939 to 1942. You can see that nothing much happened in 1939 because the war started in the September of 1939 and there wasn't that much action going on. But in 1940 was when France capitulated. A lot of European countries fell into German hands and Italian hands, and the British had to fight it off alone. Hitler was thinking of invading the British home islands, and this is when the Luftwaffe launched the Battle of Britain, where they were trying to take over British airspace, and so the RAF had to fight it all. They were averaging more than 1,000 missions from August till October of 1940. That was when the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force was fighting over the skies of Britain, of English airspace. And in 1941, actually it peaked again, over to more than 1,000 missions per month from June until October 1941. The reason being, this was when the Axis, the German and Italian, actually launched an invasion of Mediterranean countries like Greece and Malta, and as a result, the RAF had to respond to this invasion. They were launching more and more air missions in their region, and as a result, that's why we're seeing an uptick in the number of missions and a peak in the month of August. And this is when actually Greece fell into German hands, and the RAF had to evacuate from that area. In 1942 was when the Allied were actually at the lowest point of war, when Germany, Italy, and Japan had taken control of over most of Europe, parts of Russia, parts of North Africa, most of the Mediterranean countries, and a lot of countries in the Pacific region. So there were not a lot of actions going on because they were on the defensive. The U.S. had just started to enter the war, and they were still building up the military presence in the Pacific. So that's why there's not much action in this year. And then in 1943, this is the offensive stage. Now, in late 1942, in the Pacific, there was the Battle of Midway, and the Japanese Navy and Air Force were decisively defeated by the Allied powers, and as a result, the United States were becoming more confident, and they were launching more and more missions, and we can see that from the beginning of the year in the month of March, they were already averaging more than 1,000 missions, 1,000 sorties every month. And in 1943 as well, the Africa Corps was defeated in May. So the German and Italian forces surrendered in North Africa, And as a result, that paved the way for the Allies to go into Italy and to liberate the Mediterranean countries and Italy and Sicily. And in July to September of 1943, that was when the Operation Husky, or Operation to invade Sicily, happening. And that was why we're seeing an uptick in the number of air missions to support that operation. They were also trying to fight back in the Pacific, and the U.S. forces were trying to invade New Guinea and Solomon Islands in the Pacific in these months up the way until the late until December. And in 1944, the Allies were now on full offensive mode, and they were invading the Axis forward, the Axis in all fronts. And you can see that in the months of June to August 1944, they were averaging more like 8,000, 9,000 missions per month. The reason being, in the month of June was when the Allied forces landed on Normandy in France, and they had to support, the Air Force had to support the invasion all the way until the month of August. That was when they finally liberated almost all of France. Paris was liberated, and the Germans were retreating back further into Germany. So this is why we're seeing an uptick, the peak of air missions in 1944. And there was also the U.S. Marines were also taking over Guam from the month of July until the end of the year. Guam and the Mariana Islands in the Pacific in 1944. In 1945, the Allies were on the offensive again, and they were trying to finally defeat the Axis powers. And as we can see here, in March and April of 1945 was when the fighting inside Germany was the highest. So the Allied forces were now inside Germany, and they were trying to just, trying to fight this and to bring the Germany down, right? So after that, in April was when Hitler committed suicide, and then in the month of May, Germany finally surrendered in the 8th of May. So then we see a massive drop in the number of air missions after Germany surrendered in Europe. So because there's only one enemy left to defeat, that is in Japan. And in June to August actually was when the Okinawa was taken. So Okinawa was Japanese home island. It was the last stepping stone for the U.S. forces in the Pacific to launch an invasion of Japanese mainland. But they were not trying. They were not trying to invade Japan. They were trying to build the atomic bomb, and as a result, they were teasing military operations in these months. And in September, 2nd of September, was when the Japanese finally surrendered, and that was the end of the year actually, for officially for the Allied forces. But there were still pockets of Japanese resistance all the way until December. So that's why we're still seeing some missions in December of 1945. So the conclusion is that the use of air power by the Allied forces in a concerted effort to end the war was very much evident in World War II, and it's also aligned with Duhat's doctrine that air power must work independently and also in support of the other military branches of other operations to win the war. And the second is that there is a correlation between the situation in battlefield and the number of air missions flown by the Allies. The first phase of defensive phase of the Allied air missions in 1939-1942 was where the Allied were on the defense. They had fewer air missions, they had fewer airborne aircraft. In this period, also the British were carrying uh, the much of the burden to carry air missions. The U.S. had not joined the war. And then in the offensive phase was when the Allies started to gain momentum and began to launch numerous operations to defeat the Axis. The number of air missions flown and airborne aircraft drastically increased in these years. This is also because the Allies were following the general rule of thumb in World War: the attacker, because they're now attacking forces, right? And the Axis powers were on the defensive. The attacker has to have a 3-to-1 forces ratio with the defender. So that's why it drastically increased the number of air missions in those years in order to defeat the defenders. And the last conclusion is that more air missions actually launched in the theater operations where there was a lot of action. So Europe, Pacific, Mediterranean were where we're seeing most of the air power air missions, because these are the areas where the actions were happening a lot. So that's the conclusion. So yeah, that's fair. That is very much for me, and I thank you.